Welcome, my friend. You've found a quiet place to rest your thoughts. Tonight, I'll guide you through a story gentle and slow about one of the most influential figures in psychology, Carl Rogers, a quiet revolutionary who believed that within every person lies a seed of wisdom waiting to unfold, who explored the mind, discovering the healing power of genuine presence, empathy without judgment, and the radical act of truly listening to another human soul. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychology and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the landscape of the soul. Tell me in the comments what draws you most: the mystery of dreams, the spark of emotion, the intangibility of spirit, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the life and work of Carl Rogers as we wander the corridors of the unconscious and listen to the whispering mind beneath the mind. Carl Ransom Rogers was born on January 8, 1902, in Oak Park, Illinois, a comfortable suburb just west of Chicago. The fourth of 6 children, he entered a world balanced between the century's turn and the promise of modernity, a world where Victorian sensibilities still lingered like morning mist, slowly burning away under the rising sun of progress. Oak Park was a place of tree-lined streets and sturdy homes, where families like the Rogers cultivated respectability, discipline, and a particular brand of American industriousness. His father, Walter Rogers, was a successful civil engineer, a man of practical mind and firm conviction. His mother, Julia Cushing Rogers, was deeply religious, devout in that earnest Protestant way that saw godliness in every choice, every moment, every breath. She loved her children fiercely, but her love came wrapped in the language of duty, righteousness, and a watchful concern for their moral development. Imagine young Carl in that household, quiet, sensitive, observant. The Rogers home was not unkind, but it was strict, guided by principles that left little room for ambiguity or emotional exploration. The family did not attend movies or dance, did not play cards or engage in frivolous entertainments. Life was serious, purposeful, oriented toward higher things. Religion was not merely practice, but the very architecture of meaning itself. And within this careful structure, Carl learned to be a good boy, obedient, studious, somewhat isolated from the rougher play of neighborhood children. He withdrew into books, into the safety of ideas, into the quiet corners where observation replaced participation. When Carl was 12, his family moved to a farm about 30 miles west of Chicago. His father had purchased the land partly for investment, partly to remove his growing children from the corrupting influences of the city. On the farm, Carl found both solitude and a new kind of education. He became fascinated by the scientific study of agriculture, reading extensively about farming methods, hybridization, and animal husbandry. His father encouraged this, seeing in it the practical application of knowledge. But for Carl, something else was happening. He was learning to observe carefully, to notice patterns, to test hypotheses against reality. He watched how organisms grew, adapted, responded to their environments. He saw that life, given the right conditions, had an inherent tendency toward growth and development. This early observation, though he would not articulate it for many years, planted seeds that would eventually flower into his understanding of human psychology. The farm years were lonely in their way. Carl was bright but shy, socially awkward, insulated by his family's values from the broader social world of adolescence. He did not date. He did not rebel in the ways that young people often do. Instead, he turned inward, cultivating an inner life rich with thought and wonder, but also marked by a certain anxiety, a sense of being different, of not quite fitting into the world around him. He was, as he would later describe himself, a solitary and rather sober youth, one who lived much in his own mind. In 1919, Carl enrolled at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, initially planning to study agriculture, following the path his father had encouraged. But something shifted in those early college years. He became involved in campus religious activities, joining the YMCA, participating in Christian conferences. In 1922, he was selected as one of 12 American students to attend a World Student Christian Federation conference in Beijing, China. This journey, lasting 6 months, was transformative. It was Carl's first real exposure to different cultures, different ways of thinking, different approaches to spirituality and meaning. In China, he encountered people whose religious convictions were as deep as his own family's, yet utterly different in form and content. He began to question the absolutes he had been raised with, to wonder whether truth might be more plural, more complex than he had been taught. This questioning was both exhilarating and terrifying. Carl wrote to his parents from China, sharing some of his evolving thoughts, his doubts about Orthodox Christianity. The letters caused his mother great distress. She worried for his soul, and in her worry, she responded with the only language she knew, the language of religious certainty and moral concern. For Carl, this created a painful rift. He loved his mother, but he could no longer accept her worldview uncritically. He was beginning the long, difficult process of separating his own thoughts and feelings from the expectations and judgments of those he loved. This experience of navigating the tension between external authority and internal truth would later become central to his understanding of psychological health. Upon returning to the United States, Carl switched his major from agriculture to history, still searching for his path. But he was increasingly drawn to questions of meaning, purpose, and helping others. In 1924, he graduated from Wisconsin and married Helen Elliott, his childhood sweetheart, whom he had known since he was a young teenager. Helen was a gentle, intelligent woman, an artist by temperament, and their marriage would become one of the stable anchors of Carl's life, lasting until her death in 1979. Together, they would have 2 children, David and Natalie. After graduation, Carl decided to enter Union Theological Seminary in New York City, one of the most liberal and intellectually vibrant religious institutions in the country. He wanted to become a minister, to work with people, to help them find meaning and navigate their struggles. Union Seminary in the 1920s was a remarkable place, a crossroads of progressive theology, social gospel activism, and philosophical inquiry. The faculty encouraged students to question, to wrestle with doubt, to integrate modern knowledge with ancient traditions. It was exactly the environment Carl needed. But even as he studied theology, Carl found himself gravitating towards psychology. Union Seminary had a cooperative relationship with the neighboring teachers' college at Columbia University, and Carl began taking courses there in psychology and education. He discovered that what truly fascinated him was not theological doctrine, but the actual experience of people, how they thought, how they felt, how they changed. He wanted to understand the processes by which human beings grew, suffered, and healed. Theology, he realized, was too abstract, too removed from the immediate encounter with human struggle. Psychology offered something more direct, more practical, more grounded in observable reality. In a deeply significant move, after 2 years at Union Seminary, Carl made the formal decision to leave religious training and pursue a doctorate in clinical psychology at Teachers College. This was not a rejection of the spiritual questions that had drawn him to ministry, but rather a shift in how he would approach them. He would seek to help people not through preaching or theological interpretation, but through understanding and facilitating their own psychological processes. It was a choice that would define his life. At Teachers College, Carl studied under several influential faculty members, but perhaps none more important than Lita Hollingworth, a pioneering psychologist who specialized in child development and clinical work. He also came under the influence of John Dewey's pragmatic philosophy, which emphasized experience, growth, and the democratic ideal of trusting individual capacity. The intellectual atmosphere at Columbia was empirical, progressive, and optimistic about human potential. Carl absorbed these influences, but he also began to notice tensions. The psychological establishment of the time was increasingly dominated by behaviorism on one hand and Freudian psychoanalysis on the other. Behaviorists like John Watson and later B.F. Skinner saw human beings as essentially mechanical, shaped entirely by environmental contingencies. Freudians saw people as driven by unconscious forces, primitive drives, and early traumas. Both perspectives, Carl began to feel, missed something essential, the subjective experience of the person, their conscious striving toward meaning, their capacity for self-directed growth. After completing his Ph.D. in 1931, Carl took a position at the Rochester Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in Rochester, New York. This was far from the prestigious academic appointment he might have sought. It was difficult, underfunded work with troubled children and families at the margins of society, but it was. Here, in the trenches of practical clinical work, the Carl Rogers began to develop the ideas that would eventually revolutionize psychotherapy. In Rochester, Carl spent 12 years working primarily with delinquent and disadvantaged children. He conducted interviews, administered tests, wrote case studies, and attempted various therapeutic interventions. The prevailing approach at the time was highly directive. The therapist was the expert who diagnosed the problem and prescribed the solution. The therapist would interpret, advise, instruct. The client was essentially passive, a subject to be analyzed and corrected. Carl began with this approach because it was what he had been trained to do. But gradually, through countless hours of actual practice, he began to notice something. The interpretations and advice he offered, no matter how clever or psychologically sophisticated, often didn't help. Clients would nod politely and then continue their patterns, but occasionally, something different would happen. In certain moments, when Carl simply listened, really listened, without judgment, without rushing to interpret clients, would begin to speak more honestly, to explore their own feelings more deeply, to discover insights of their own. In those moments, change seemed to happen organically, from within. There was one particular case that Carl would later describe as pivotal in his development. He had been working with a mother whose son was experiencing behavioral problems. Carl, following his training, had been trying to get her to see how her own history and conflicts were affecting her relationship with her son. He had offered interpretation after interpretation, but nothing seemed to land. Finally, feeling frustrated and defeated, Carl gave up his agenda. At the end of one session, he basically admitted that he didn't know how to help her. The woman stood to leave, paused at the door, and then turned back. She asked if Carl took adults for counseling. Surprised, he said yes. She sat back down and, for the first time, began to talk about her own pain, her own feelings of inadequacy and confusion. Over the following weeks, working from her own concerns rather than Carl's interpretations, she made significant progress. Her relationship with her son improved. Carl had learned something profound. The client knows better than the therapist what hurts, what matters, and what direction healing needs to take. His job was not to impose understanding, but to facilitate the client's own process of self-discovery. This realization was the seed of what would become client-centered therapy, though it would take years for Carl to fully articulate and develop the approach. During his years in Rochester, he also engaged with the ideas of Otto Rank, a dissident psychoanalyst who broke from Freud and emphasized the importance of will, creativity, and the present relationship between therapist and client, rather than endless analysis of the past. Rank's ideas resonated with Carl's emerging sense that therapy was not primarily about expert interpretation, but about the quality of relationship and the client's own movement toward health. In 1940, Carl accepted a position as professor of psychology at Ohio State University. This was a significant step, bringing him into the academic world where he could teach, conduct research, and develop his ideas more systematically. At Ohio State, Carl began articulating his approach more formally. In 1942, he published his first major book, Counseling and Psychotherapy: Newer Concepts in Practice. In this book, he challenged the dominant directive approaches and introduced what he called non-directive counseling. The idea was simple but radical. The therapist should not direct the course of therapy by imposing interpretations, diagnoses, or advice. Instead, the therapist should follow the client's lead, reflecting back what the client expresses, helping them clarify their own feelings and thoughts. The assumption was that human beings have within themselves vast resources for self-understanding and positive change, and these resources can be tapped if the therapist provides the right psychological climate. The academic world was not entirely ready for this message. Carl's colleagues in the psychology department at Ohio State were skeptical. His approach seemed unscientific, too optimistic, naive about human darkness and pathology. But Carl was patient and methodical. He began to conduct research, using new technology to record therapy sessions on phonograph discs. This was revolutionary. Therapy had always been a black box, known only to therapist and client. Now it could be studied, analyzed, taught. Carl and his students would transcribe sessions, code the interactions, analyze patterns. They discovered that certain therapist behaviors were consistently associated with positive client outcomes. These behaviors were not technical interventions, but relational qualities: empathy, warmth, genuineness, and unconditional positive regard. In 1945, Carl moved to the University of Chicago, where he established and directed the university's counseling center. The Chicago years, from 1945 to 1957, were perhaps the most productive of his life. Here, Surrounded by talented graduate students and colleagues, Carl developed his approach into a comprehensive theory of personality and therapy. He refined his terminology, moving from non-directive counseling to client-centered therapy, a term that better captured his philosophy. It wasn't just about avoiding direction, but about centering the entire therapeutic enterprise on the client's own experience, perceptions, and capacity for growth. At the heart of Carl's developing theory was the concept of the actualizing tendency. Drawing on his early observations of organisms on the farm, his study of biology, and his years of therapeutic experience, Carl came to believe that there is one basic motive in human beings: the tendency to actualize, maintain, and enhance the experiencing organism. This is not a list of drives or instincts, but a single, fundamental directional force. Just as a seed contains within it the template for the whole plant and will grow toward light and health given the right conditions, human beings have within them an inherent tendency toward growth, complexity, autonomy, and self-realization. This was a profoundly optimistic view, standing in stark contrast to Freud's emphasis on destructive drives and the behaviorist's view of humans as empty vessels shaped entirely by reinforcement. But if humans have this actualizing tendency, why do we see so much dysfunction, suffering, and stagnation? Carl's answer lay in what he called conditions of worth. From earliest childhood, we need love, acceptance, and positive regard from others, especially our parents and primary caregivers. But this regard is rarely unconditional. More often, it comes with strings attached. We learn that we are loved when we behave in certain ways, when we achieve certain things, when we suppress certain feelings. I love you when you're good. A parent might communicate implicitly or explicitly. I love you when you succeed. I love you when you don't cry. I love you when you make me proud. These conditions of worth become internalized, forming what Carl called the conditions of worth. We begin to value ourselves only when we meet these conditions. We develop a self-concept, a picture of who we are, that is conditional, fragile, dependent on external validation. The problem is that these conditions of worth are often at odds with our own organismic experience, our own felt sense of what we need, value, and feel. A young boy may feel scared and want to cry, but he's being taught that boys don't cry. A young girl may feel angry, but she's being taught that nice girls don't get angry. A teenager may yearn to pursue art, but he's being taught that success means becoming a doctor or lawyer. When there is incongruence between organismic experience and self-concept, psychological distress results. We begin to deny or distort our own experience, to shut off parts of ourselves that don't fit the approved picture. We become defended, anxious, rigid. We lose touch with what Carl called organismic wisdom, the body's felt sense of what is right, what is needed, what is true for us. This was Carl's understanding of psychopathology, and it was strikingly different from the medical model that dominated psychiatry and clinical psychology. He did not see mental illness as disease entities to be diagnosed and treated. He saw psychological problems as the natural result of incongruence, of the split between the self as experienced and the self as conceived, a split maintained by rigid conditions of worth and the defensive need to maintain a particular self-image. The neurotic is not sick. The neurotic is a person whose actualizing tendency has been thwarted, whose growth has been distorted by the need to maintain conditional regard. If the problem is incongruence and conditional regard, then the solution is an environment of unconditional positive regard, where the person can gradually reintegrate their experience, relax their defenses, and move back toward congruence. This is what therapy provides. Carl identified 3 core conditions that, if provided by the therapist, are both necessary and sufficient for therapeutic personality change. These 3 conditions became the foundation of his approach: congruence, empathic understanding, and unconditional positive regard. Congruence, also called genuineness or authenticity, means that the therapist is real in the relationship, not hiding behind a professional facade. The therapist's inner experience matches their outer expression. They are integrated, present, human. This does not mean the therapist shares every passing thought or feeling, but that there is no pretense, no playing a role. When the client encounters a congruent therapist, they encounter a real person, and this authenticity invites them to be real as well. Empathic understanding means that the therapist deeply and accurately understands the client's subjective world, seeing it as much as possible from the client's own frame of reference. This is not sympathy, feeling sorry for someone. Empathy is feeling with someone, entering their perceptual world without judgment or distortion. Carl described it as sensing the client's private world as if it were your own, but without ever losing the as-if quality. The therapist tries to understand not just the words, but the feelings beneath the words, the meanings that are perhaps only dimly felt by the client themselves. And the therapist communicates this understanding back, checking and refining it in an ongoing dance of relational attunement. Unconditional, positive regard means that the therapist accepts the client completely, without conditions or reservations. The therapist prizes the client as a person, no matter what the client is feeling, saying, or doing. This is not approval of all behaviors or agreement with all choices. It is acceptance of the person's experience as valid, their feelings as real and important. It is the communication, through words and presence, that the client is valued simply for being, not for meeting certain conditions. The therapist does not require the client to be different, better, less angry, less depressed, more insightful. The therapist meets them exactly where they are, and in that meeting conveys a profound message. You are acceptable as you are. Carl believed that if these 3 conditions are present in the therapeutic relationship, and if the client perceives them at least to some degree, then a predictable process unfolds. The client, feeling safe and accepted, begins to explore their experience more fully. They allow into awareness, feelings, and perceptions that have been denied or distorted. They become less defensive, less rigid. They begin to trust their own organismic valuing process, their own sense of what is right for them. Their self-concept becomes more flexible, more congruent with their actual experience. They move from a state of fixity and stagnation to a process of becoming. They actualize more of their potential. They become, in Carl's language, more fully functioning persons. The fully functioning person was Carl's vision of psychological health. This is not a fixed endpoint, but an ongoing process. The fully functioning person is open to experience, trusting their own organismic reactions, living in the present moment rather than being rigidly bound by past conditioning. They are creative, adaptive, reliable, not because they follow rigid rules, but because they are deeply in touch with their own values and the requirements of each situation. They experience a sense of freedom, and responsibility, making choices based on their own locus of evaluation rather than constantly seeking external approval. They trust themselves, trust the process, trust life. During the Chicago years, Carl and his colleagues conducted extensive research to test these ideas. The counseling center became a laboratory where therapy sessions were recorded, transcribed, and analyzed. Client outcomes were measured. The relationships between therapist-offered conditions and client change were studied quantitatively. This research was groundbreaking. Carl brought the scientific method to bear on the therapeutic relationship itself, making therapy transparent and researchable in ways it had never been before. The findings consistently supported his theory. Therapist, empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard were indeed predictive of positive client outcomes across a wide range of client problems and populations. This was revolutionary for multiple reasons. First, it democratized therapy. If healing depends not on expert interpretation or technical intervention, but on the quality of relationship, then therapy is accessible to a much wider range of helpers. You don't need years of training in psychoanalytic theory or behavioral conditioning. You need the capacity to be genuine, empathic, and accepting. Second, it shifted power in the therapeutic relationship. The client, not the therapist, is the expert on their own experience. The client's perceptions, feelings, and goals are the center of therapy. Third, it provided an alternative to both the medical model of mental illness and the mechanistic assumptions of behaviorism. Human beings are not just stimulus-response machines or bundles of pathology to be cured. They are organisms with inherent wisdom and direction, capable of self-healing when provided the right conditions. Carl's ideas spread rapidly. By the early 1950s, he was one of the most well-known psychologists in America. His 1951 book, Client-Centered Therapy, became a foundational text, widely read by students and practitioners. He was invited to give lectures and workshops across the country and internationally. His approach resonated especially with those who felt constrained by the authoritarian aspects of traditional psychoanalysis and the coldness of behaviorism. Social workers, counselors, educators, clergy, and psychologists found in Carl's work an approach that honored the humanity of both client and helper. But Carl was not content to keep his ideas within the confines of individual therapy. He believed that the principles he had discovered applied far beyond the consulting room. If unconditional positive regard, empathy, and congruence facilitated growth in therapy, might they not also facilitate growth in education, in organizations, in all human relationships? In 1957, Carl left the University of Chicago to return to his home state, taking a position at the Carl University of Wisconsin. He hoped to apply his ideas to work with severely disturbed psychiatric patients, to demonstrate that his approach could be effective even with those diagnosed with schizophrenia. The Wisconsin years, from 1957 to 1963, were difficult. Carl encountered resistance from the medical establishment in the psychiatric hospital, where he attempted to conduct research. Psychiatrists trained in the medical model were skeptical, sometimes hostile, to his humanistic approach. The research he conducted had mixed results, partly due to the difficulties of implementing client-centered therapy in a hospital environment dominated by other philosophies. Carl found himself increasingly frustrated with academic politics, with the rigidity of institutions, with the gap between the ideals of psychology and the realities of practice. In 1963, at the age of 61, Carl made a bold move. He left academia altogether and moved to Jolla, California, joining the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute, a progressive think tank. A few years later, he helped found the Center for Studies of the Person, where he could work freely without the constraints of university bureaucracy. The California years, from 1963 until his death in 1987, were a time of continued evolution and expanding application of his ideas. In California, Carl became deeply involved in the human potential movement that was flowering in the 1960s and 70s. He began facilitating encounter groups, intensive group experiences, where people would gather for extended periods, weekends, or even weeks to engage in authentic communication, personal exploration, and group process. These encounter groups were based on the same principles as client-centered therapy, creating a climate of psychological safety, empathy, and acceptance, where people could drop their facades and connect more authentically with themselves and others. The encounter groups became enormously popular. Thousands of people participated in workshops led by Carl and others trained in his approach. The groups were places of emotional intensity, where people cried, confronted, revealed hidden aspects of themselves, experienced moments of deep connection and understanding. Critics worried about the potential for psychological harm, about untrained facilitators, about the cultish atmosphere that could develop. But Carl believed deeply in the process. He saw in the groups the same actualizing tendency at work, magnified by the group context. When people felt safe enough to be real, magic happened. Barriers dissolved. Empathy flowed. People discovered capacities in themselves they hadn't known existed. Carl began to travel internationally, facilitating workshops in Europe, Asia, South America. He became interested in applying his approach to conflict resolution, to bridging political and cultural divides. In the 1980s, he facilitated workshops bringing together Catholics and Protestants from Northern Ireland, Israelis and Palestinians, black and white South Africans, Americans and Soviets. These were not therapy groups, but peace-building initiatives, based on the conviction that if people could really listen to each other, really hear each other's humanity, then even the most intractable conflicts might begin to shift. Carl was convinced that the principles of empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard were not just therapeutic techniques but fundamental requirements for human flourishing at every level: individual, relational, societal, global. In his later years, Carl also became more explicitly philosophical and even spiritual in his writings. Though he had left formal religious training behind, he never lost his sense of wonder at the mystery of human existence. He spoke of a formative tendency in the universe, a direction not just in human beings, but in all of nature, toward greater complexity, order, and interrelatedness. He pondered questions of consciousness, of transcendence, of the edges where psychology touches the numinous. He corresponded with theologians and philosophers, always curious, always open to new perspectives. In his book, A Way of Being, published in 1980, he reflected on his life's work and his evolving sense of what it means to be fully human. Carl Rogers died on February 4th, 1987, in La Jolla, California. Following surgery for a fractured hip, He was 85 years old. He had lived a long, productive life, had seen his ideas spread around the world, had influenced millions of people, therapists, educators, parents, leaders, seekers. He had moved from the strict religious home of his childhood to become one of the most important voices for human freedom, dignity, and potential in 20th century psychology. His journey was one of continuous learning, of questioning authority, of trusting the process, of believing, against considerable evidence to the contrary, in the fundamental goodness and wisdom of human beings. Let us now move deeper into Carl Rogers' work, into the architecture of his ideas, the nuances of his therapeutic approach, and the revolution he sparked in how we understand psychological healing and human growth. At the center of Rogers' thought is the actualizing tendency, and it is worth dwelling here, letting this idea unfold slowly, examining it from different angles. The actualizing tendency is not a vague optimism or sentimental belief that people are nice. It is a biological fact, observable in all living organisms. A seed in darkness will grow toward light, bending and twisting to find it. An infant will struggle to crawl, to walk, to master their body, despite countless falls. An injured animal will lick its wounds, seek shelter, work to heal. At every level of life, there is a directional force toward maintenance, enhancement, and realization of potential. This is not a static drive toward homeostasis, mere equilibrium. It is a dynamic movement toward increasing complexity, differentiation, and autonomy. Rogers saw this tendency operating in human psychology as powerfully as in physiology. We are not just motivated to reduce tensions or satisfy drives, as Freud suggested. We are motivated to grow, to learn, to become more than we were. An infant is not content to simply lie and be fed. They reach for objects, babble sounds, explore their world. A child is not satisfied with mastery of one skill. They continually seek new challenges, even in the most difficult circumstances, even when the actualizing tendency is blocked or distorted. It continues to operate. The criminal, the addict, the depressed person each is actualizing as best they can given their circumstances and their learned conditions of worth. Their behavior, however destructive, is an attempt to maintain and enhance the self as they have come to conceive it. This view has profound implications. It means that the therapist does not have to motivate the client, do not have to push or persuade or cajole. The motivation for growth is already there, inherent, waiting to be released. The therapist's job is not to fix or change the client, but to provide conditions under which the client's own actualizing tendency can operate more freely. It is like gardening. The gardener does not make the plant grow. The plant grows itself. The gardener provides soil, water, sunlight, removes weeds and pests. Similarly, the therapist provides psychological conditions, empathy, acceptance, genuineness, and trusts the process. This trust in the actualizing tendency is what Rogers called organismic trust, and it extends to trusting one's own felt sense, one's own bodily reactions and emotions as guides to what is right. In a healthy, congruent person, the organismic valuing process operates smoothly. The person experiences something, notes their reaction, and uses that information to guide their choices. If something feels right, expanding, life-affirming, the person moves toward it. If something feels contracting, diminishing, the person moves away. This is not impulsive hedonism or selfish pursuit of pleasure. The organismic valuing process takes into account the whole organism, including the need for connection, meaning, and contribution to others. A fully functioning person trusts that their deepest reactions, when attended to carefully, will guide them toward choices that are both personally satisfying and socially constructive. But for most people, this organismic valuing process is significantly impaired. From early childhood, we learn to distrust our own reactions and defer to external authorities. We learn that what we feel is not valid, not acceptable. We internalize conditions of worth, standards by which we judge ourselves worthy or unworthy of love. These conditions are usually learned from parents, but they are reinforced throughout life by peer groups, cultural messages, institutions. You are valuable if you succeed. You are lovable if you please others. You are acceptable if you conform. Rogers gives the example of a boy who is taught that he should not feel hostility toward his younger brother. The boy does feel hostility. It is a natural organismic reaction to having to share parental attention and resources. But the parent says, "You don't really feel that way. You love your brother." The parent withdraws affection when the boy expresses negative feelings. The boy is faced with a terrible dilemma. He needs his parents' love more than he needs to acknowledge his own feelings, so he denies the feelings. He says to himself, "I do not feel hostility. I love my brother." This is defensive distortion, the denial or distortion of one's own experience in order to maintain conditional positive regard. Over time, these distortions accumulate. The boy becomes a man who cannot acknowledge anger, who experiences vague anxiety whenever hostile feelings begin to emerge, who cannot understand why he sometimes acts in ways that undermine his brother. The feelings do not go away. They are simply denied access to awareness. They operate outside conscious control, creating incongruence between the self as experienced and the self as conceived. The person becomes defensive, rigid, unable to grow because they are cut off from significant portions of their own experience. Carl Rogers saw that therapy must address this incongruence. The goal is not insight in the psychoanalytic sense, understanding the unconscious roots of behavior through interpretation. The goal is congruence, reintegrating denied or distorted experience, bringing the self-concept into alignment with organismic experience. How does this happen? Through the therapeutic relationship itself. When a client encounters a therapist who offers unconditional positive regard, the client begins to experience something new. Here is a person who accepts them without conditions, who does not withdraw approval when difficult feelings emerge. The client can say, "I hate my brother," and the therapist does not recoil, does not judge, does not correct. The therapist simply listens, reflects, seeks to understand. It sounds like you have very strong negative feelings toward your brother. The client, feeling this acceptance, can explore the feelings more fully. "Yes, I do. I resent him. I always have." And then, perhaps, "I feel guilty saying that." The therapist, part of you resents him, and another part feels guilty for the resentment. The client, "Yes, I was never allowed to feel that way." The therapist, "It wasn't okay to have those feelings." The client, "No, my parents always said I should love him." In this exchange, the therapist is not interpreting, not explaining, not advising. The therapist is simply reflecting, clarifying, staying very close to the client's own experience. But something important is happening. The client is being heard, accepted, met. The feelings of resentment are being validated as real, as part of the client's experience, not as bad or wrong, but as understandable human reactions. In the safety of this accepting relationship, the client can lower their defenses. They can allow into awareness feelings that have been denied. They can begin to accept in themselves what the therapist accepts. This is the process Rogers called therapeutic personality change. The client becomes more open to experience, less defensive. Their self-concept becomes more flexible, able to incorporate aspects of experience that were previously denied. They become more congruent. Their inner experience matches their outward expression. They trust their own organismic reactions more, rely less on external approval. They move from fixity toward process, from defensiveness toward openness, from incongruence toward congruence. But this process requires a very particular kind of relationship. The therapist must genuinely embody the core conditions: congruence, empathy, and unconditional positive regard. These are not techniques to be applied, but ways of being in relationship. Let us explore each more deeply. Congruence, or genuineness, means that the therapist is authentic, transparent, real. The therapist does not hide behind a professional mask or play a role. What the therapist feels inside matches what they express outside. This does not mean the therapist blurts out every passing feeling or uses the therapy session to work through their own issues, but it means that the therapist is psychologically present, not defensive or artificial. If the therapist feels confused by what the client is saying, they might say, "I'm having trouble following you. Can you say more about that?" If the therapist feels moved by the client's pain, that emotion might show in their voice or expression. The therapist is a real human being, not a blank screen or an omniscient authority. Why is congruence important? Because it establishes the relationship as real. If the therapist is genuine, the client can trust that the empathy and acceptance they receive are also genuine, not merely professional politeness. Authenticity invites authenticity. When the client encounters a congruent therapist, they receive implicit permission to be congruent themselves, to drop their facades, to be real. Empathy is perhaps the most subtle and most powerful of the core conditions. Rogers spent years trying to articulate what he meant by empathy, refining his understanding through practice and research. Empathy is not simply repeating back what the client says. It is not a technique of reflection, though reflection can be a vehicle for empathy. Empathy is an attitude, a way of being with another person. It is the attempt to sense the client's private world as if it were your own, to perceive the client's feelings and meanings accurately and deeply, and to communicate that understanding back to the client. Imagine a client says, "I don't know what to do about my marriage. My husband doesn't understand me." A non-empathic response might be advice: "Have you tried couples counseling?" Or interpretation: "It sounds like you're recreating the relationship you had with your father." An empathic response stays very close to the client's immediate experience. You're feeling stuck and alone, like there's a wall between you that you can't get through. The empathic therapist is not jumping ahead, not analyzing, not fixing. They're trying to understand and reflect the felt sense of the client's experience. And importantly, empathy is tentative, checking, The therapist offers their understanding not as a pronouncement, but as a hypothesis to be confirmed or refined. Is that right? Is it something like that? This tentative quality invites the client to correct, to go deeper, to clarify their own experience. Through the back and forth of empathic understanding and client response, the client comes to understand their own experience more clearly. The empathic therapist is like a psychological mirror, helping the client see themselves more accurately. But empathy goes beyond cognitive understanding. True empathy has an affective component feeling with. When a client expresses pain, the empathic therapist feels resonance with that pain, not identically, but in a parallel, shared human way. This emotional resonance is communicated non-verbally through tone of voice, facial expression, quality of presence. The client senses that they are not alone, that their experience is being held, met, shared. This is profoundly healing in itself. Much suffering comes from isolation, from the sense that one's experience is unique, shameful, unbearable. When someone else can sit with that experience, meet it without flinching, the experience becomes more bearable. The client discovers they can survive their own feelings, that they are not destroyed by them. Rogers believed that empathy was both difficult and learnable. It requires the therapist to set aside their own frame of reference, their own judgments and assumptions, and enter the client's world. It requires focused attention, sensitivity to subtle cues, willingness to be wrong, commitment to checking understanding. Research has consistently shown that therapist empathy is one of the strongest predictors of positive therapy outcomes across all types of therapy and all types of clients. More than specific techniques, more than theoretical orientation, empathy matters. Unconditional positive regard is perhaps the most challenging of the core conditions. It means prizing the client, valuing them, accepting them without conditions. No matter what the client reveals, no matter how they are feeling or acting, the therapist's regard remains constant. This does not mean approving of all behaviors or agreeing with all choices. A client might describe having hurt someone, having acted selfishly or destructively. The therapist does not condone the behavior, but neither does the therapist reject the client. The therapist communicates something like, "You are a person of worth. You matter. Your feelings and experience are important, even when you act in ways that hurt yourself or others." This is radically different from conditional regard, which says, "I accept you when you're good, when you meet my standards." Conditional regard, as we have seen, creates defensiveness and incongruence. The person learns to hide parts of themselves, to present only the acceptable face. Unconditional positive regard creates safety. When a client knows they will not be rejected, they can risk being fully known. They can explore the shameful, the frightening, the unacceptable parts of themselves. And in that exploration, in bringing those parts into the light of acceptance, the parts often transform. Rogers did not claim that unconditional, positive regard was easy. He acknowledged that therapists are human, with their own values, judgments, and reactions. There will be moments when the therapist feels irritation, boredom, disapproval. Congruence means acknowledging those reactions honestly when they persistently interfere with empathy and regard. But the overall stance, the fundamental attitude, is one of deep respect for the client as a person. The therapist sees beyond the behavior to the struggling human being beneath. The therapist believes that even the most disturbed or destructive client has an actualizing tendency, has the capacity for growth if provided the right conditions. In practice, these three core conditions work together synergistically. Congruence makes empathy and regard credible. Empathy makes regard tangible and specific. Regard creates the safety necessary for the client to be congruent themselves. The client, over time, internalizes the therapist's accepting attitude. They begin to offer themselves empathy and unconditional positive regard. They become, in effect, their own therapist. This is why Rogers called his approach client-centered. The locus of control, the source of change, is in the client, not the therapist. The therapist facilitates, but the client heals themselves. Rogers also believed that these core conditions were not just necessary, but sufficient for therapeutic change. This was a bold claim that sparked considerable debate. Sufficient means that if these conditions are present, no other interventions are needed. The therapist does not need to provide insight, interpretations, homework assignments, behavioral techniques. The relationship itself is the vehicle of change. Critics argue that this was too simplistic, that different clients need different approaches, that some problems require specific interventions. Rogers countered that he was not claiming that empathy, congruence, and regard were the only factors that could help people. He was claiming that they were universally necessary and, when fully present, sufficient to activate the client's own actualizing tendency. Other techniques might be useful, but they worked, Rogers believed, primarily insofar as they were embedded in a relationship characterized by the core conditions. Over decades of research, this hypothesis has been tested extensively. The evidence is complex. Clearly, the core conditions are important and consistently associated with positive outcomes. But equally clearly, specific techniques and interventions can add value for specific problems. The contemporary consensus in psychotherapy research is that both relationship factors and technical factors matter, and that the most effective therapy integrates both. Nonetheless, Rogers' emphasis on the relationship was a corrective to an overly technical approach, and his insistence on the centrality of empathy, congruence, and positive regard has become foundational in all effective therapy, regardless of theoretical orientation. Rogers' approach also had profound implications for the training of therapists. Traditional training emphasized diagnosis, theory, technique. Trainees learn to categorize clients, to apply interventions based on diagnostic categories. Rogers argued that the most important thing in training was not the accumulation of theoretical knowledge, but the development of the therapist's own capacity for empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. This meant training focused on self-awareness, personal growth, supervised practice with feedback on the quality of the therapeutic relationship. Rogers advocated for the use of recorded sessions so that trainees could review their own work, notice their own empathic failures, celebrate their successes, refine their way of being with clients. This was again controversial. Some argued it was anti-intellectual, that therapists needed solid grounding in psychopathology, personality theory, and research. Rogers did not dismiss knowledge, but he prioritized relational capacity. He believed that a warm, empathic, genuine person with less technical knowledge would be more helpful than a cold, distant expert. And research has largely supported him. Therapist empathy and the quality of the therapeutic alliance are stronger predictors of outcome than therapist experience or theoretical orientation. Rogers also extended his principles beyond individual therapy. He saw applications in education, which he called student-centered learning. Traditional education, he argued, was authoritarian and stifling. The teacher was the expert who transmitted knowledge to passive students. Students were motivated by grades, praise, and the avoidance of punishment. Learning was externally imposed rather than internally motivated. Rogers proposed an alternative: create a classroom climate of empathy, acceptance, and genuineness, and trust students' own curiosity and desire to learn. The teacher becomes a classroom climate, facilitator, not a lecturer. Students participate in choosing what to learn, how to evaluate their own progress. The emphasis is on experiential learning, relevance, personal meaning. Rogers taught in this way himself. His classes at Chicago and Wisconsin were often unstructured, which frustrated some students. Carl would come to class and ask, "What would you like to discuss today?" Long silences would ensue. Some students found this liberating. Others found it maddening. But those who engaged with the process reported transformative experiences. They learned to trust their own questions, to take responsibility for their own learning, to think critically rather than simply absorbing authority. Rogers also worked with organizations and management. He believed that the same principles applied. Organizations that treated employees as mere cogs in a machine that relied on control and fear were less effective than organizations that trusted employees, valued their input, created conditions for autonomy and creativity. He consulted with businesses and nonprofits, advocating for participative management, open communication, and genuine concern for employee well-being. This was radical in the 1950s and 60s, though some of these ideas have since become mainstream in management theory. Perhaps the most ambitious application of Rogers' principles was in the realm of conflict resolution and peace building. In the 1970s and 80s, Rogers facilitated numerous workshops with groups in conflict. These were intensive group experiences, sometimes lasting many days, where participants from opposing sides, political, ethnic, religious, would come together in a setting designed to foster empathic listening and open communication. One of the most notable of these was a workshop in Austria in 1985 with leaders from the Cold War superpowers. Carl facilitated a meeting between Soviet and American citizens, including psychologists, educators, and public figures. The setting was informal, far from the rigidity of official diplomacy. Participants were encouraged to speak personally, to share their fears, their hopes, their perceptions. Rogers established ground rules emphasizing listening, empathy, and suspension of judgment. As the workshop progressed, something remarkable happened. The stereotypes began to break down. The evil empire, Soviets, revealed themselves to be human beings, concerned about their children's future, afraid of nuclear war, yearning for peace. The imperialist Americans revealed similar fears and hopes. Participants listened to each other deeply, sometimes for the first time really hearing the other side's perspective. They did not come to agreement on all political issues, but they came to a place of mutual recognition and respect. Some participants described the experience as life-changing, a glimpse of what might be possible if empathy and genuine encounter replaced rhetoric and posturing. Rogers was hopeful, but not naive, about such work. He knew that a single workshop would not resolve geopolitical conflicts, but he believed that the principles he had discovered in therapy, that genuine empathic listening and acceptance create the conditions for change applied at every level, from the individual to the international. If people could truly listen to each other, could truly see each other's humanity, then enemies could become, if not friends, at least human beings capable of coexistence. Rogers' influence extended far beyond psychology. His ideas resonated with the counterculture movements of the 1960s and 70s, which emphasized authenticity, self-exploration, and questioning of authority. The encounter group movement, in which Rogers was a central figure, became a significant cultural phenomenon. Thousands of people participated in weekend workshops and longer intensives, seeking personal growth, deeper connection, and authentic community. The encounter group movement eventually declined, partly due to excesses and controversies, but its influence persisted in the fields of humanistic psychology, group psychotherapy, and organizational development. In education, Rogers' ideas influenced progressive educators and informed movements toward student-centered learning, experiential education, and holistic education. Teachers who encountered his work found permission to trust their students, to create democratic classrooms, to focus on the whole person rather than just academic achievement. In medicine and healthcare, Rogers' emphasis on empathy and patient-centered care has become increasingly influential. Medical schools now teach communication skills, emphasizing the importance of listening to patients, understanding their experience, and involving them as partners in their own care. This shift, though still incomplete, reflects Rogers' insight that the quality of the relationship is fundamental to healing. In coaching and counseling, Rogers' approach has become foundational. Life coaches, career counselors, pastoral counselors, and many other helping professionals draw on client-centered principles. The techniques of active listening, reflective responses, and non-judgmental presence are taught widely and have become standard practice. In the field of psychotherapy research, Rogers was a pioneer. His insistence on recording and studying therapy sessions opened the black box of therapy to scientific scrutiny. His research on the core conditions established that relationship factors are crucial to outcome. Subsequent research has continued to refine understanding of empathy, therapeutic alliance, and the mechanisms of change. Rogers' contribution to making psychotherapy an evidence-based practice cannot be overstated. Rogers also contributed to the development of humanistic psychology as a distinct school of thought, often called the third force in psychology, after psychoanalysis and behaviorism. Along with Abraham Maslow, Rollo May, and others, Rogers articulated a vision of psychology that emphasized human potential, personal growth, meaning, and values. Humanistic psychology was a corrective to what Rogers saw as the reductionism and pessimism of prevailing approaches. It affirmed the subjective experience of the person, the importance of consciousness and free will, the search for meaning. Though humanistic psychology as a distinct school has waned in prominence, many of its core ideas have been absorbed into mainstream psychology and psychotherapy. The positive psychology movement, with its focus on strengths, well-being, and human flourishing, owes a significant debt to Rogers and his humanistic colleagues. Contemporary integrative therapies often incorporate client-centered principles alongside cognitive, behavioral, and psychodynamic techniques. One area where Rogers' influence has been particularly strong is in the practice of motivational interviewing, a therapeutic approach developed in the 1980s and 90s for working with ambivalence about change, especially in addiction treatment. Motivational interviewing explicitly draws on Rogers' principles of empathy, acceptance, and support for client autonomy. The technique involves empathic listening, reflective responses, and eliciting the client's own motivations for change. Research has shown motivational interviewing to be highly effective, and it is now widely used in healthcare, social work, and counseling. Rogers' ideas have also influenced the mindfulness movement in psychology and therapy. Though Rogers did not use the term mindfulness, his concept of openness to experience and organismic trust resonate with mindfulness principles of present moment awareness, non-judgmental acceptance, and trust in one's own direct experience. Mindfulness-based therapies emphasize the quality of presence and acceptance that Rogers advocated, both in the therapeutic relationship and in the client's relationship with themselves. In the realm of spirituality and personal growth, Rogers' work has inspired countless seekers. His vision of the fully functioning person, his trust in the actualizing tendency, his emphasis on authenticity and inner guidance, these resonate with spiritual traditions that emphasize the inner light, the true self, the wisdom within. Rogers himself was interested in the spiritual dimensions of human experience, though he approached them from a psychological rather than theological perspective. In his later years, he was open to discussing his sense of the transcendent, the mystical, the mystery at the heart of life. Rogers' legacy is complex and multifaceted. He was a revolutionary who challenged the power dynamics and assumptions of his field. He was a scientist who brought rigor and research to the study of the therapeutic relationship. He was a humanist who affirmed the dignity and potential of every person. He was an optimist who believed in the fundamental trustworthiness of human beings, even when evidence seemed to suggest otherwise. And he was a man who lived his own principles, who continued to grow, question, and evolve throughout his long life. Critics of Rogers have raised several important challenges. Some argue that his approach is culturally bound, reflecting Western individualistic values that may not apply in more collectivist cultures, where the autonomous self is not the primary locus of value. Rogers' emphasis on internal locus of evaluation, self-direction, and personal autonomy makes sense in a culture that prizes individual freedom but may be less relevant or even problematic in cultures that emphasize harmony, duty, and collective well-being. Others have questioned Rogers' optimism about human nature. His belief in the actualizing tendency and the inherent trustworthiness of the organism seems to overlook the reality of human destructiveness, evil, and the capacity for self-deception. Psychoanalysts argue that Rogers underestimated the power of unconscious drives and defenses. Existentialists point out that he paid little attention to the darker aspects of existence: death, meaninglessness, isolation. Rogers will likely respond that he did not deny these realities, but that his focus was on facilitating the conditions under which people can confront and integrate them more effectively. There are also questions about the sufficiency of Rogers' approach. While the core conditions are important, are they really sufficient for all clients and all problems? What about clients with severe trauma, psychosis, or personality disorders? What about specific behavioral problems that might respond more effectively to structured interventions? Contemporary therapists generally agree that while the core conditions are necessary, they may not always be sufficient, and that different clients benefit from different approaches. Another critique concerns the concept of unconditional positive regard. Is it really possible to offer unconditional acceptance? Are there not times when a therapist's acceptance might enable harmful behavior? Rogers would say that unconditional positive regard does not mean condoning destructive actions, but rather accepting the person while being clear about the impact of their actions. The therapist might say, "I respect you as a person, and I'm concerned about the choices you're making." This distinction is subtle and can be difficult to navigate in practice. Despite these criticisms, Rogers' contribution to psychology and psychotherapy is undeniable. He changed the field fundamentally, shifting attention from technique to relationship, from expert authority to client empowerment, from diagnosis to understanding. His influence can be seen in contemporary therapy practice, in the training of mental health professionals, in the emphasis on evidence-based practice, and in the widespread recognition that empathy, genuineness, and respect are foundational to all helping relationships. Now, as we move into the final part of our journey, let us step back from the specifics of Rogers' biography and theory and reflect more broadly on what his work means, what it reveals about the human condition, and how it fits into the larger tapestry of psychological and spiritual understanding. Let us allow our thoughts to become more contemplative, more philosophical, more personal. Let us wander through the implications of Rogers' vision, examining it from different angles, letting it speak to the deepest questions of what it means to be human, to grow, to heal, to connect, to become. At the heart of Carl Rogers' work is a profound question. What does it mean to be genuinely yourself? This question haunts all of us in different ways throughout our lives. We grow up in a world that tells us who to be, what to value, how to act. We internalize countless messages about acceptability and worth. We learn to perform, to present certain faces to the world while hiding others. We become, in Rogers' terms, incongruent split between who we are in our inner experience and who we appear to be outwardly. This incongruence is the source of much suffering. It creates anxiety because we must constantly monitor and control our expression to maintain the image we believe is necessary for love and acceptance. It creates depression because we feel disconnected from our own life, as if we are watching ourselves from the outside rather than living from the inside. It creates a sense of meaninglessness because we are not really living our own life, but rather following a script written by others. Rogers offers a vision of liberation from this bind. He suggests that we can trust ourselves, that our own organismic experience is a valid guide, that we do not need to constantly defer to external authorities to know what is right for us. This is a radical proposition, and it can be frightening. If we let go of the internalized rules and conditions of worth, what will we find? Will we discover a dark, selfish, destructive core? Rogers says no. He says that when we strip away the defenses, when we allow ourselves to be fully in touch with our experience, we discover not darkness, but a complex, multi-layered human being capable of both selfishness and generosity, anger and love, fear and courage. And we discover that our deepest organismic reactions are trustworthy, that they take into account not just our immediate impulses, but our need for connection, meaning, and contribution. This is not to say that the organismic self is always pleasant or easy. The fully functioning person is not blissfully happy all the time. They feel sadness, anger, fear, confusion. But they feel these emotions fully, without defense or distortion. They allow the emotions to inform them, to teach them, to guide their choices. And in doing so, they live more richly, more authentically, more fully. Rogers' vision is deeply humanistic. It affirms human dignity and potential. It says that people are not fundamentally flawed or sinful or in need of external control. Rather, people have within them the resources for growth and healing. What they need is not fixing, but freedom. Freedom from conditions of worth, freedom from judgment, freedom to explore their experience honestly and make choices that align with their deepest values. This vision resonates with many spiritual traditions. The idea that truth is found within, that each person has access to inner wisdom, that the divine spark resides in every soul. These are themes found in mysticism, Quakerism, Buddhism, and many other traditions. Rogers, though not religious in a conventional sense, was deeply spiritual in his affirmation of the inherent worth and potential of every human being. His concept of the actualizing tendency echoes the spiritual notion of an inner light or Buddha nature, a core goodness that seeks expression. But Rogers' approach is also distinctly psychological. He grounds his insights in observation, research, and practice. He does not require belief in any particular metaphysical system. His claim is empirical. When people are provided certain conditions, they change in predictable ways. The actualizing tendency is not a theological assertion, but an observable pattern in living organisms. This integration of the spiritual and the scientific is part of what makes Rogers' work so compelling. He offers a vision that is both inspiring and practical, both transcendent and grounded. He speaks to those who seek meaning and growth, but he does so in a language and framework that is accessible, researchable, and applicable in everyday contexts. One of the most profound aspects of Rogers' work is his understanding of the role of relationship in psychological healing and growth. He saw that we are not self-sufficient monads, but deeply relational beings. Our sense of self is formed in relationship. Our wounds occur in relationship, and our healing happens in relationship. The conditions of worth that create incongruence are learned in our earliest relationships, when we are most vulnerable and most dependent on others' regard. And the unconditional positive regard that heals incongruence must also come through relationship first from the therapist, then gradually internalized until we can offer it to ourselves. This relational understanding has deep implications. It suggests that we cannot fully understand the individual apart from their relationships. It suggests that mental health is not just an individual property, but a quality of the relational field in which one lives. A person may be quite healthy in certain relationships and quite disturbed in others, depending on the degree of empathy, acceptance, and congruence present. This also means that therapy is not something the therapist does to the client, but something that emerges between them. The therapeutic relationship is co-created. Both therapist and client are changed by the encounter. Rogers often spoke of learning from his clients, of being moved and transformed by the depth of their struggles and their courage. The therapist is not a detached expert, but a fellow human being, engaging in authentic encounter. This has echoes in the philosophy of Martin Buber, who distinguished between I-it relationships, where the other is treated as an object or thing, and I-thou relationships, where the other is met as a full subject, a unique being. Rogers' approach aims for I-thou encounters, where both therapist and client are fully present, meeting each other in their humanity. In such moments, something sacred happens. Walls dissolve, isolation is overcome, and connection is experienced at a deep level. Rogers also believed that this quality of encounter is not limited to therapy. It is possible in friendship, in marriage, in parenting, in teaching, in any human relationship. When we meet another person with empathy, acceptance, and genuineness, we create the conditions for growth and healing. This means that therapy is not a specialized technical procedure, but an intensification of something that happens, or should happen, in all healthy relationships. This democratizes healing. It suggests that we all have the potential to be healers for each other, simply by being present, listening deeply, and accepting without judgment. We do not need advanced degrees or specialized training to offer basic human empathy and regard. Of course, professional therapists have skills and training that enhance their effectiveness, but the core of healing is not exotic or arcane. It is profoundly human and accessible. This vision is hopeful, but it also carries a challenge. If healing happens through relationship, then the quality of our relationships matters enormously. How often do we really listen to each other? How often do we put aside our own agendas, judgments, and advice to simply be with another person in their experience? How often do we offer unconditional acceptance rather than conditional regard? Most of us, if we are honest, fall short. We listen with half our attention, waiting for our turn to speak. We judge, we advise, we try to fix. We withdraw our warmth when others displease us. We hide behind roles and facades rather than showing up authentically. We do these things not because we are bad, but because we are defended, because we ourselves carry conditions of worth, because we are afraid of being hurt or rejected. Rogers' work invites us to examine our own way of being in relationship. Can we be more present? Can we listen more deeply? Can we accept others and ourselves more fully? This is not easy work. It requires courage to let go of defenses, to risk being known, to face our own incongruence. But Rogers believed it was possible, and that it was the path toward becoming more fully human. Another dimension of Rogers' work worth contemplating is his understanding of change. In many models of therapy and self-improvement, change is something we impose on ourselves. We identify problems or deficits, and we work to eliminate them. We set goals and push ourselves toward them. There is a violent quality to this, a sense of war against parts of ourselves, a domination of the bad parts by the good parts. Rogers offers a different understanding. Change, he suggests, does not come through self-rejection or forced self-improvement, but through self-acceptance. The paradox is that we change by accepting ourselves as we are, not by rejecting ourselves as we are. When we can accept our feelings, our impulses, our limitations, without judgment, they begin to shift organically. The anxiety that seemed unbearable becomes just anxiety, uncomfortable, but manageable. The anger that we feared becomes energy that can inform our boundaries and choices. The sadness that we try to avoid becomes a door to deeper self-understanding and compassion. This is counterintuitive. It seems like accepting our problems would make them permanent. But Rogers observed again and again that the opposite is true. When we fight against our experience, it becomes entrenched. When we accept it, it flows and changes. The client who can say, "I am deeply anxious, and that is okay," often finds that the anxiety lessens. The client who feels compelled to get rid of anxiety often spirals into greater distress. This principle has profound implications for how we live. What if we applied it not just in therapy, but in all areas of life? What if, instead of constantly trying to fix and improve ourselves, we practiced accepting ourselves? What if we could say, "I am flawed, confused, struggling, and that is part of being human," not as an excuse for harmful behavior, but as a starting point for genuine change? Rogers believed that the actualizing tendency, once freed from the constraints of conditions of worth and defense, would naturally move the person toward growth, health, and constructive living. We do not have to force ourselves to grow. We only have to remove the obstacles. This is like the practice of gardening again. The gardener does not make the plant grow. The gardener removes weeds, provides water, ensures adequate sunlight. The growing is done by the plant itself. This perspective is both relieving and challenging. Relieving because it suggests we can stop the exhausting work of trying to be someone we are not. Challenging because it asks us to trust a process we cannot fully control, to let go of our tight grip on ourselves and allow something more organic to unfold. There is a contemplative quality to this, a willingness to be present with what is, rather than constantly striving for what should be. This aligns with mindfulness practices, with meditation, with various forms of spiritual practice that emphasize presence, acceptance, and letting go. Rogers, though not a formal practitioner of meditation, was pointing toward a similar stance. Be present with your experience, accept it without judgment, trust the process. Let us also consider Rogers' emphasis on the present moment. Much traditional therapy focused on the past childhood experiences, early traumas, unconscious conflicts formed long ago. Rogers did not dismiss the past, but he emphasized the present. What matters most is not what happened decades ago, but how you are experiencing yourself and the world right now. The question is not, why are you this way? But what are you experiencing in this moment? This focus on present experience is radical in its simplicity. It suggests that healing does not require endless archaeological excavation of the past. It happens now, in the immediacy of authentic encounter and self-awareness. Of course, the past shapes the present, and sometimes exploring the past is useful. But the healing itself happens in the now, as the person allows themselves to fully experience what is, as they integrate denied or distorted aspects of experience into conscious awareness. This present-centeredness also reflects Rogers' process orientation. He saw human beings not as fixed entities, but as ongoing processes of becoming. We are not things but flows, not nouns but verbs. The fully functioning person is not a static state of perfection, but a dynamic process of continual adaptation, learning, and growth. We are always becoming, always in motion. This process view is both humble and hopeful. Humble because it acknowledges that we never arrive at a final destination, never achieve complete self-realization. There is always more to learn, more to integrate, more to become. Hopeful because it means that change is always possible, that we are not locked into fixed patterns, that growth can happen at any age and any stage. Rogers' later writings reflect an increasingly philosophical and even mystical sensibility. He spoke of being part of a larger process, a formative tendency in the universe itself. He wondered whether the direction he observed in individuals toward greater complexity, order, and interrelatedness was reflected in the cosmos as a whole. Is there a universal tendency toward evolution, toward the emergence of ever more complex and conscious forms? Rogers did not claim to have answers, but he was drawn to these questions. In these reflections, Rogers touched on themes that connect psychology with spirituality, science with mysticism. He was pondering the nature of consciousness, the relationship between the individual and the whole, the possibility of meaning and purpose in a vast and indifferent universe. These are ancient questions, and Rogers approached them with a sense of wonder and humility. One of the questions that emerges from Rogers' work is the nature of the self. What is this self that we speak of? Rogers distinguished between the organism, the total, ongoing, experiencing of the person, and the self-concept, the organized, consistent, conceptual gestalt composed of perceptions of the I or me. The organism is fluid, immediate, pre-reflective. The self-concept is constructed, organized, reflective. Psychological problems arise when there is incongruence between the two, when the self-concept cannot accommodate the fullness of organismic experience. This raises deep questions. Is there a true self beneath the constructed self-concept? Rogers seemed to suggest, yes, there is an organismic self, a bodily felt sense of being, that is more fundamental than the narrative self. This organismic self is trustworthy, wise, directional. When we are congruent, we are in touch with this deeper self. When we are incongruent, we are living primarily in the constructed self-concept, which may be rigid, distorted, out of sync with actual experience. This parallels insights from various contemplative traditions. Buddhism speaks of the constructed self as an illusion and points to a deeper, more fundamental awareness. Hindu philosophy distinguishes between the individual self and the universal self, Atman. Western mysticism speaks of the false self and the true self. Rogers, coming from a psychological rather than spiritual framework, arrived at similar insights. There is a deeper, more authentic way of being that is obscured by defensive constructions. But Rogers was careful not to reify the self, not to turn it into a metaphysical entity. He saw the self as a process, not a thing. The self is not a fixed essence, but an ongoing organization of experience. It is something we do, not something we are. This processual view is compatible with contemporary neuroscience, which sees the self as an emergent property of complex biological and psychological processes rather than a singular entity located somewhere in the brain. What does it mean, then, to know thyself? That ancient injunction carved at Delphi? For Rogers, self-knowledge is not primarily intellectual understanding, not a catalog of facts about one's personality. Self-knowledge is experiential awareness, the ongoing felt sense of one's own experiencing. It is the capacity to be present with oneself, to notice one's feelings, reactions, impulses, without judgment or defense. It is organismic awareness. This kind of self-knowledge is never complete. It is not something we achieve once and for all, but something we practice moment by moment. The fully functioning person is not someone who has complete self-knowledge, but someone who is open to their experience, able to notice and integrate new aspects of themselves as they emerge. Rogers also understood that self-knowledge is not solitary. We come to know ourselves through relationship, through the mirror of others' empathic understanding. We need others to reflect us accurately and acceptingly. In their presence, we see ourselves more clearly. This is why therapy works, and why all deep relationships are potentially transformative. They offer us the chance to be seen, to be known, to discover ourselves in the eyes of another who accepts us. Let us also consider the political dimensions of Rogers' work. Though he was not overtly political, his ideas have political implications. Unconditional positive regard is a radical egalitarian principle. It says that every person has inherent worth, regardless of status, achievement, or behavior. This stands in opposition to social systems based on hierarchy, merit, and conditional value. If we took Rogers seriously, how might it change our approach to education, criminal justice, healthcare, social welfare? In education, it would mean respecting every student's capacity and trusting their desire to learn rather than sorting and ranking them according to standardized measures. In criminal justice, it would mean seeing offenders as human beings capable of change rather than simply punishing and excluding them. In healthcare, it would mean treating patients as partners in their own care, respecting their autonomy and listening to their experience. In social policy, it would mean supporting people unconditionally, trusting that given the right conditions, they will move toward productive and healthy lives. These implications are utopian in flavor, and they challenge deeply ingrained assumptions about human nature and social control. Rogers was aware of this. He knew his vision was countercultural, but he believed it was grounded in empirical observation. When people are trusted and supported, they rise to the occasion. When they are controlled and judged, they become defensive and stagnant. Of course, implementation is complex. Unconditional positive regard does not mean absence of boundaries or accountability. It does not mean tolerating harm, but it does mean fundamentally rethinking how we approach human problems, moving from a stance of judgment and control to one of understanding and support. Rogers' work in peace-building and conflict resolution was an attempt to apply these principles at the societal level. He believed that the same dynamics that operate in individual therapy operate in groups and societies. Enemies are enemies because they do not really see each other, do not understand each other's experience. They are locked in defensiveness, unable to hear anything but threat from the other side. What is needed is a context for empathic listening, for real encounter, for humanization. When people from opposing sides really listen to each other, stereotypes break down. They may not agree on policy, but they can recognize each other's humanity. And this recognition is the foundation for peaceful coexistence. This is hopeful, but also humble. Rogers did not believe that encounter groups would solve global conflicts, but he believed they could plant seeds, shift perspectives, create possibilities. He was part of a broader movement in the 20th century toward humanizing the other, toward recognizing our common humanity across all divisions. This work continues, more urgent than ever in our polarized times. Rogers' emphasis on empathy and understanding is particularly relevant now. We live in an age of rapid communication, but often shallow connection. We are bombarded with information, but we rarely truly listen. We form opinions based on headlines and sound bites, rarely entering into the lived experience of those different from us. We judge quickly, empathize slowly. Rogers invites us to slow down, to listen more deeply, to seek understanding before judgment. This is not easy. It requires patience, humility, and a willingness to be changed by what we hear. But it is perhaps the most important skill we can cultivate, both individually and collectively. Let us now turn to the question of suffering, which is central to any psychological or spiritual system. What does Rogers' approach tell us about suffering? He did not minimize it or offer easy consolations. He acknowledged that life involves pain, loss, disappointment, fear. But he saw much of our suffering as coming not from these inevitable pains, but from our defensive response to them. We suffer because we cannot accept our experience, because we judge ourselves for what we feel, because we are at war with ourselves. A person experiences sadness, but they have learned that sadness is weak or self-indulgent, so they push it away, deny it, try to numb it. This creates a secondary suffering, a struggle against a sadness that is often more painful than the sadness itself. If they could simply allow the sadness, feel it fully without judgment, it would move through them. It might still hurt, but it would not have the quality of anguish that comes from internal conflict. Rogers' approach to suffering is one of acceptance and integration. Do not run from the pain. Turn toward it. Do not judge it. Accept it. Do not try to fix it immediately. Be present with it. This sounds like passivity, but it is actually profoundly active. It takes courage to face our pain rather than avoid it. But in facing it, we often discover that we are stronger than we knew, that we can bear what we feared would destroy us. This does not mean that all suffering is psychological, or that acceptance is a cure-all. There is real tragedy in the world, real injustice, real loss. Rogers did not dismiss these, but he believed that our relationship to our experience makes an enormous difference. Two people might face similar losses, but if one can grieve openly and the other cannot, their suffering will be qualitatively different. The one who can grieve will eventually integrate the loss and move forward. The one who cannot will carry the loss as a festering wound. Rogers also believed that suffering can be transformative. The person who has faced deep pain and come through it often emerges more compassionate, more wise, more fully human. Not because suffering is good in itself, but because the process of facing and integrating suffering can deepen us. The fully functioning person is not someone who has avoided pain, but someone who has lived through it with openness and courage. This brings us to the question of meaning. Viktor Frankl, another influential psychologist, emphasized that the search for meaning is central to human existence, and that suffering becomes bearable when it is infused with meaning. Rogers did not focus on meaning in the same way, but his approach implies a particular understanding of meaning. Meaning, for Rogers, is not something imposed from outside or derived from abstract principles. Meaning emerges from authentic engagement with one's own experience and values. The fully functioning person does not need to search for meaning. They create it through the process of living authentically. When you are congruent, when you trust your organismic reactions, when you make choices that align with your deepest values, your life has meaning. It is the meaning that comes from integrity, from wholeness, from living your own life rather than someone else's script. This is not a grand cosmic meaning, but a personal, felt sense of significance and direction. Rogers' vision, then, is not about finding the meaning of life in some ultimate sense, but about living a meaningful life through authenticity and congruence. Each person's meaning is unique to them, arising from their particular values, interests, and commitments. There is no one right way to live, no external standard to meet. There is only the question: are you living your own life? Are you true to yourself? This existential dimension of Rogers' work connects him to existential philosophy and therapy. Like the existentialists, Rogers emphasized freedom, choice, and personal responsibility. Like them, he acknowledged the anxiety that comes with freedom. When we let go of external authorities and trust ourselves, we face the vertigo of choice. There is no guaranteed right answer, no certainty, no escape from responsibility. This is both liberating and terrifying. But Rogers was more optimistic than many existentialists. While they emphasized the absurdity of existence and the weight of freedom, Rogers emphasized the actualizing tendency and the trustworthiness of the organism. He believed that when we are truly in touch with ourselves, our choices will tend toward growth, connection, and constructive living. We are not alone in a meaningless void. We are part of a larger process, a directional tendency toward complexity and consciousness. This brings us to Rogers' spirituality, which was implicit rather than explicit in much of his work. In his later years, Rogers spoke more openly about his sense of the transcendent, the mystical dimensions of deeply authentic human encounter. He described moments in therapy when something beyond the purely personal seemed to be present, when therapist and client were in such deep communion that boundaries blurred, when insights emerged that surprised both parties. He spoke of these moments with reverence, as experiences of grace or presence. Rogers did not try to explain these experiences in religious terms. He was content to acknowledge the mystery, but he honored them as real and significant. In a culture that often reduces everything to material explanation, Rogers kept space for the numinous, the ineffable, the sacred dimensions of human experience. This openness to mystery is part of what makes Rogers' work enduringly appealing. He was a scientist who honored subjectivity. He was a psychologist who made room for the spiritual. He was a humanist who saw divinity in humanity. He integrated, or at least held in creative tension, aspects of experience that our culture often splits apart. As we come near the end of our journey through the life and work of Carl Rogers, let us rest for a moment in contemplation of what he offers us. Here was a man who believed in people, who trusted the human capacity for growth and healing. Here was a man who listened, really listened, and in listening, helped others find their own voices. Here was a man who challenged the authorities of his field, who insisted on a more humane and respectful approach to therapy. Here was a man who lived his values, who continued to grow and question throughout his long life. Rogers reminds us that we are not machines to be fixed or animals to be trained. We are experiencing beings, capable of awareness, choice, and self-direction. We have within us resources for healing and growth that are often untapped. What we need is not more control or more judgment, but more freedom and more acceptance. We need space to explore, to feel, to discover ourselves. We need relationships where we are met with empathy and respect. We need to learn to trust ourselves, to listen to our own inner wisdom. This message is both simple and profound. Simple because it boils down to treating ourselves and others with empathy, acceptance, and genuineness. Profound because it challenges so much of how we have been taught to live. We have been taught to seek approval, to meet external standards, to distrust our own reactions. Rogers invites us to reverse this, to look inward, to trust the organismic self. Living this way is not easy. It requires courage to be authentic, to face our own experience without defense, to risk being fully known. It requires patience to listen deeply to others, to set aside our own agendas and judgments. It requires humility to acknowledge that we do not have all the answers, that we are all in process, all becoming. But Rogers believed, based on decades of observation and practice, that this way of being is both possible and deeply rewarding. When we can be more fully ourselves, when we can connect more authentically with others, life becomes richer, more meaningful, more fully alive. We tap into the actualizing tendency, that fundamental life force that moves toward growth and complexity. We become, in Rogers' language, more fully functioning persons. What would the world look like if more of us lived this way? If we approached each other with empathy and acceptance rather than judgment? If we trusted people's capacity for growth rather than trying to control them? If we created institutions and systems based on Rogers' principles, education that honors student autonomy, healthcare that respects patient experience, justice that believes in human capacity for change, this is a utopian vision, perhaps. But Rogers showed that it is not just fantasy. It is grounded in observable reality. When the conditions are right, people grow. When they feel safe and accepted, they open up. When they're trusted, they become trustworthy. This happens in therapy, in classrooms, in workshops, in relationships. It is a small-scale utopianism, but it is real, and perhaps, if practiced widely and consistently, it could scale up, could begin to transform larger systems and cultures. Rogers' legacy is not just his theories or techniques, but his way of being in the world. He modeled what he taught. He was genuinely interested in people, curious about their experience, willing to learn from them. He was humble about his own knowing, open to being wrong, committed to ongoing growth. He took risks, challenged convention, followed his own path even when it led him away from prestige and safety. He was, in his own way, a fully functioning person, living the principles he articulated. And so we come full circle, back to the image of Carl Rogers, the quiet revolutionary, the man who believed in listening. In a world that so often speaks without hearing, judges without understanding, acts without reflection, Rogers offered a different way. Listen, he said. Really listen. Listen to others. Listen to yourself. In that listening, in that deep, attentive presence, something heals, something opens, something becomes possible that was not possible before. As you drift towards sleep, let these ideas settle into you. There is no need to grasp them tightly or analyze them fully. Let them be like stones dropped into a still pond, creating ripples that spread and fade. Carl Rogers spent his life exploring the question of what it means to be fully human, fully alive. His answer was deceptively simple. Be yourself, accept yourself, trust yourself, and in relationship with others, offer them the same gift, the gift of empathic presence, of unconditional acceptance, of genuine encounter. You, too, have within you an actualizing tendency, a directional force toward growth. You, too, carry conditions of worth that constrain and confuse you. You, too, yearn to be known and accepted as you are. Roger's work is an invitation to trust your own experience, to listen to your own inner voice, to move toward congruence between your inner self and your outer expression. It is an invitation to be kinder to yourself, more patient with your own process, more accepting of your own humanity. And it is an invitation to extend that kindness to others, to listen more deeply, to judge less harshly, to see the struggling human being beneath the behavior, to recognize that we are all, in our own ways, trying to actualize, trying to grow, trying to find our way in a complex and often confusing world. This is the gift of Carl Rogers, not a technique or a theory, but a way of being, a way of approaching ourselves and others with curiosity, compassion, and respect, a way of trusting the process of life, even when we cannot see where it leads, a way of believing that growth is possible, that change happens, that we are all capable of becoming more fully ourselves. Let this be your lullaby tonight. You are acceptable as you are. You have within you the resources you need. You can trust your own experience. You're in process, always becoming. And you are not alone. In the quiet darkness, in the space between waking and sleeping, know that you are part of a larger whole, a formative tendency that moves through all living things toward greater complexity, consciousness, and connection. Rest now, friend. Let the ideas and images of Carl Rogers' life and work drift through your mind like clouds across a twilight sky. Let them comfort you, inspire you, remind you of your own potential and your own worth. Tomorrow you will wake to a new day, and you will have choices to make, challenges to face, relationships to navigate. But tonight, simply rest. Trust that the actualizing tendency is at work in you even now, even in sleep, organizing, healing, moving you toward wholeness. Carl Rogers believed in you, believed in all of us. He saw what we could become when freed from the constraints of conditions of worth and defensive distortion. He saw the fully functioning person in each of us, waiting to emerge. And he spent his life creating conditions in therapy rooms, in classrooms, in encounter groups, in workshops around the world where that emergence could happen. His work continues through all who have been touched by his ideas, all who practice empathic listening, all who offer unconditional positive regard, all who trust the actualizing tendency in themselves and others. In this way, Carl Rogers lives on, not as a distant historical figure, but as a presence, an influence, a voice still speaking to us across the years. Listen, accept, trust, become. And so, as your breathing slows and your body relaxes, as the concerns of the day fade into the background, take with you this final thought. You are enough. Right now, exactly as you are enough. Your feelings are valid. Your experience matters. Your journey is your own. Trust it. Trust yourself. Trust the process. The night is quiet. The world is still. And in this stillness, something within you grows, changes, heals. It is the actualizing tendency, the quiet force that moves through all living things. It has brought you this far, and it will carry you forward into tomorrow, into all your tomorrows. You are part of something larger, something beautiful, something that tends toward life and growth and light. Sleep now, peaceful and safe, in the knowledge that you are exactly where you need to be, that you are becoming who you are meant to be, and that the journey, with all its twists and turns, all its joys and sorrows, is unfolding exactly as it should. Carl Rogers walked this path before you, and he left markers along the way. Empathy, acceptance, genuineness, trust. Follow these markers, and you will find your way home. Home to yourself, to your own inner truth, to the fully functioning person you have always been, waiting patiently beneath all the defenses and distortions, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Welcome that person. Welcome yourself. And in the welcoming, find peace. Good night.